Hello and welcome back to the final installment of the Winter Blanket Cowl. We are going to get started by blocking our pieces. I'm using this Sewrella wool wash, and we're just going to put in enough so that it gets a little bit milky looking, a little foggy in the water. We're going to swirl it around, mix it in, make sure we're all good to go. And you should be able to see a little bit at the bottom. You can add more if you like so that you can't. I don't like to use too much of this. It is pretty concentrated, I like to think. And we're just going to go ahead and get our squares and drop them in. So I've been doing mine a few at a time. You can dump in more than this. Normally I have, I guess, as much as the sink can hold without it being too much, making sure that all of them are able to get wet. So we're going to make sure that we submerge these, let them sit for a little bit, and then we're going to get started taking these out and getting them dried, so I will show you that process next. So you can see here, I'm just getting some of the excess water out. I don't like to wring these or squeeze them because that will destroy the shape, and then I lay them all flat on a towel. The next thing I do is I fold this over and I'm going to roll all of the squares up tightly, and this is to get out the extra moisture without destroying the shape of the square itself. So you can get as big of a towel as you need, squeeze everything out as best you can, and then we're just going to unroll it. And I let these dry for a little bit before I block them. So this is the next day. I'm going to begin blocking these. I have this pegboard, which you can find the link for below in the description. And I just start out with only 4 pegs on here. These are set at about 4.5 inches apart because that is our blocked goal for these squares to reach our blanket dimensions. So I'm going to go ahead and get all of these on there, and then I will show you how I add pegs. Okay, so I grabbed some extra pegs here, and you can see that you can just insert them through the stack. So what I do is I pick a point, I'm picking the middle of my squares, and I'm making sure that I get through every single layer of squares that I have all the way down to the bottom and inserting the hook into its spot on the board. And I'm going to do this for the middle of each of the squares, so you'll see me go around and do this. One trick that I sometimes use to help me is I will pan around to the side, make sure I'm looking at the sides of the stack to make sure that I'm getting every single stitch in there and every single layer. And that's something that's been helping me just to make sure that I'm blocking every single square and that one doesn't get left out. So I will continue this process and meet you there. Okay, so I've taken my squares off the blocking board. I let them sit for a day or two, making sure they were completely dry, and you can see them here. I also have some scrap yarn that I'm going to be using to seam these together. I'm just using the same gray yarn that I used for one of my squares. You can use any color that you used for your squares, whatever you have left over of, and enough to seam these together. So I'm actually going to be using a chart, and I will put that here. So this chart here shows you how you should be assembling your blanket. So you have the correct number of squares made up, and we're going to seam starting in the bottom left corner, working our way right. We're going to stitch vertically for those. So you can see here how I have my rows lined up. So I stitched vertically as I'm working from left to right, and then we're going to stitch horizontally once we need to connect each row that we've made according to that chart. So you can refer back to that chart at any time as we're going along here to make sure that you are working up the correct order. So I'm just going to grab my hook, the same hook that I've been using to crochet. It's a 5.5mm hook, and I'm grabbing some of this scrap yarn, and we're going to go ahead and get a slip knot just like we would to crochet regularly. And once we have that, we're going to take the 2 that we need, making sure that we're still going in order. And we're going to start at the bottom. Also make sure that your squares are facing up. So the cables should all be facing vertically. And as for the rest of the squares, the patterns that we used in those photos, we should be referring back to those. So for my gray square, you can see that I'm going to flip it around here. And for this, we want the right side up. So your starting chain, the scrap yarn from that should be facing the right-hand side. That's how you know that that's done correctly. And it should be the same going forward every gray square, which is the third square that we did. So I'm just going to slip stitch in each of these. So what you want to do is grab the outermost stitching that you can, yarn over and slip stitch, and do this all the way vertically until those two squares are completely connected. Now, I'm not too worried about this being a little messy because later on what you're going to see is the front of the blanket is going to have a quilt-like texture. So what you're going to see here as I work, you're going to see your slip stitches. They're going to be pointing up facing you. They're not going to lay flat as we normally would when connecting with a slip stitch, but you will see that on the front side of the fabric it does create a more puff-like quilted texture. And if you would prefer this back side to be invisible, you can also add a layer of fabric over it so that you're not seeing that. So I'm just going to continue slip stitching up the side until we reach the end. Okay, so we have finished up the vertical seam you can see here, and we have our next piece lined up, the tan square to my right, and we're going to go ahead and get that seam. So you see that the right side of the piece has no visible seam, but the piece we're working with does have that visible seam, and that just shows the texture. On the front is the most important. I will also like to note here that it is best to weave in your ends before starting this piece. Obviously, I did not do that here, but I should have. But it just gives you a cleaner look at what you're working with so you don't get confused or lost while you are seaming. So after this video, I will go ahead and I will seam my squares. But we're just going to go ahead and get the next piece started. So you can see that I have it here. I'm flipping it over to the right side. For this one, your tail should be on the left. And really, it doesn't matter for this one, but I just like the texture on that side better. So now I'm just going to show you how I'm seaming across. So you can see that I have the body of my blanket is on the bottom and the new row that I'm working with is on the top. So we are seaming horizontally across, and we are using the same exact method that we were before to do this one. So we are just slip stitching across. The thing to watch out for here is that you don't want to accidentally seam boxes where they don't belong. So you want the squares to line up exactly. So as you're working, just kind of keep a count of how many stitches you've done and a visual to make sure that you're on track to end both squares at the same time so that they're not off. Obviously, if they're off by a little bit when you put the blanket all together, you're going to have rows that don't line up evenly, which is not what we want. So I'm just going to go ahead and slip stitch this, and I will show you the final result. Okay, so now I have all my squares together. I'm going to grab my tapestry needle and start weaving in some of those ends. Like I mentioned before, the individual squares should have their tails weaved in prior to seaming, but I did not do that for this clip. And you will also seam any tails from seaming the squares together, which you'll have. So at the end of every seam that you do, you're going to cut, tie off, and seam in the end. So you can see here, I'm just picking up a few stitches. We're going to make the seam as invisible as possible. We're going to pull through, and then we're going to work through the same area, making sure to not have it too bulky so that it is visible, but just making sure that it is secure. And once I feel that it is secure, I will clip it off and leave that there and move on to the next one. And we're going to repeat that for the entire blanket. So you can see here the final blanket with everything seamed. You can actually add a single crochet border on the outside just to make it look a little bit cleaner, but this is what it looks like with all the ends weaved in. All of the details for this pattern can be found in the description below, as well as the written pattern. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!